Hello guys, welcome to the fiction series. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto got harem with Yoruichi, Kukaku and Harribel? Part 2. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. Karakura town is a small prefecture located in western Tokyo on the island nation of Japan, primarily under the jurisdiction of the Jusanbantai of the Gatija Santai, and has the largest concentration of spiritually aware beings in the entire world. These are just two of the reasons why a certain hermit had decided to hide himself away here in the spiritually rich environment after a strange yet fortuitous opportunity was presented to him all those years ago. While he was quite adept at hiding his own reiatsu through a combination of powerful seals and his own skill, the spiritually rich landscape of Karakura provided him far more secrecy than he could have secured for himself. Karakura town was incredibly difficult to survey for anomalies since the entire town seemed to be bathed in reiatsu, or to be more specific, as of recently it was covered almost entirely by the reiatsu of the most powerful spiritually aware human Naruto had ever heard of in all his 200 plus years. When he'd first arrived close to 120 years ago, it had seemed like a decent place for him to lay low. He changed his name, deciding to use his mother's maiden name like he had in life, and bought a large plot of land near the center of the city, utilizing the denser population in that location to hide himself and his newest companions in this crazy ride he called life. Or afterlife as it were, since Naruto had discovered that life as a soul in soul society actually had very few differences in comparison to the life of a normal human living in the human world. After you factored out the much longer lifespan of a soul and the incredible strength many of these souls had gained over such a long period of time. Both had hearts that beat in their chests, both felt joy and sadness, heartbreak and pain, and both could fall in love. He'd even learned that when two souls copulated, pregnancy was still a very real occurrence. Who knew? How else did noble families in the Sirte produce heirs? A magical stork. Would you be surprised to hear that he had actually been convinced that a magical stork really was responsible for delivering the natural-born heirs of noble families? Of course not, that would be silly, and completely true. Mind you, considering that he was in essence dead, and he had no idea how it was that new souls came into existence, he'd been forced to draw his own conclusions on the subject. That was until Yoruichi had quite literally laughed him out of the barracks one day, before explaining to him that yes, though rare, it was entirely possible. More so in those clans where families possessed an abundance of reiatsu. Back on track, after spending the equivalent of millions of US dollars on the construction of a new house on his purchased plot of land and then shaping the land to suit his tastes, he ended up with a house designed very much like the one he'd built himself in Hogyoku. When the carpenters had cleared out, the more mundane tasks having been completed, Naruto had immediately set to work upon its completion himself. Lining the outer walls and supports with a similar array of seals as he had in his old compound and adding a few other seals so that his house wouldn't show up as a suspicious dark spot devoid of reiatsu on any of the Jusanbantai's scanning devices. Effectively using the ambient energy as something like a blanket. They wouldn't be able to see who or what was inside, but it wouldn't seem empty either. For over 100 years it had worked as he'd hoped it would, and since he had very little to do and 4 very willing volunteers, Naruto had set about a little side project that wouldn't normally fit into his repertoire, studying the hollow condition. Ever since he'd first started learning seals in his youth under the tutelage of Jiraiya, puzzles had become almost laughably simple, and as far as he was concerned, a hollow was simply one large puzzle with a rather obvious piece missing. It was finding out what that missing piece represented and attempting to replicate it that was proving difficult. He spent close to 60 years on this research, often sitting on his deck with his pipe and sake, simply thinking about what he could be missing. He developed what must have been hundreds of different seals, all performing some set purpose geared towards restoring a hollow's missing heart. Of course, he quickly learned that it wasn't so simple. A plus became a hollow because of spiritual decay, or in layman's terms, because they had remained in the world of the living for far too long, or they were devoured by another hollow. It could take years for a plus to turn into a hollow if simply left alone to its own devices, especially in the case of those souls known as demi-hollows. Souls that had remained in the place they had died due to some form of strong emotional attachment, causing their broken chains of fate to literally bind them to that location until their eventual transformation into a hollow. He had observed these phenomena with great scrutiny, making sure to console them well before their transformation had reached completion, before moving on to the next subject for observation. He'd kept this up for over 6 decades, and after 60 plus years of doing nothing but research upon research, which Naruto had decided he hated with a fiery passion, he'd finally been struck by an epiphany. The transformation itself wasn't going to lead him to an answer, but the hollow's memories very well might. That was of course if they could remember anything about their lives at all, but as it had been for him, perhaps he just needed to find someone with a significant amount of reiatsu. something that had protected them from losing their memories of their lives. His newest companion was not only an extremely powerful hollow before her transformation into an arrancar, but was also willing to offer him that information, though Naruto was sure the woman was in a considerable amount of emotional pain while doing so. She was strong and hid her emotions well, but whoever said hollows felt no human emotions deserved a punch in the face. But the Nadama Rasengan. Or maybe a Rasen Shuriken, decisions. Unfortunately he still hadn't made any progress towards reversing the process of holification. It made sense to him though, he was admittedly not the smartest person in the world and someone was bound to have tried before. Perhaps it would be best if he just continued to develop new seals in his attempt and keep his eyes and ears open for anything that may help in his efforts. When in doubt, stick with something you're good at. Seals could after all do anything the user could dream up. A seal that would reverse the process of holification didn't sound too absurd when you thought of it that way. When he wasn't making new seals and training with his new allies, he was doing something he never thought he ever would, something that would make his late godfather proud. He sat about his house, using the inspiration he received from the very curvaceous and beautiful women now living with him to continue his godfather's legacy. With their permission of course, and while they knew full well what it was he was using them as reference material for, he never once asked them to take off their clothes, never peeked on them in the bath, and never made inappropriate passes at them for more research material. When they had asked if he needed them to do anything for him to help him with his creative processes, Naruto had replied thus. He had told them that them simply being there with him was enough and that he could use his imagination for the rest. Of course, he went out and bought a few Ero mangas to make sure he was getting everything right. It had been almost 200 years since he'd seen a woman naked after all minus those time when Yoruichi decided to get changed in front of him, so his memory could be a little foggy. After only a short while his effort began to pay off, and the most popular hated book series from the Elemental Nations was released to consumers living in and around Karakura, Japan. The Ichigo series had been reborn, and it was back with a vengeance, for not even a month later, his name was practically carved into the windows of every adult bookstore in the country. A month after that, every adult bookstore in the world was selling his works. It had spread like wildfire, and publishers the world over were clamoring for them like rabid dogs on raw hamburger. Practically begging him for the opportunity to publish the next release of the series. It was then that Naruto realized something almost depressing, that no matter how much anyone would try to deny it, there was one worldly truth that applied to people of every dimension. Deep down, they were all insatiable closet perverts. They would try to hide it, and some would do very well at that particular endeavor, while others just let it all hang out in the open so to speak. Others more literally than most. It was however a good way to make money, and due to its success, Naruto wouldn't have to worry about currency for at least the next 100 years. Which was just fine for him, seeing as how having a base in the world of the living could definitely prove useful in the long run. Looking back on those days, Naruto chuckled, wisps of smoke escaping through his nose and parted lips. In over 100 years, he hadn't aged a day, and had only continued to grow stronger the longer he stayed in Karakura. He trimmed his hair so it was a little neater than it had been before, keeping it at about waist length, while he made double sure to maintain his physique and keep his skills sharp while doing so. All of this training and research, all his work into continuing his late godfather's legacy, all served a singular purpose, and that was to ensure that he had a solid foundation when what he was sure to be all-out war broke out between him and Aizen's army of modified super hollows. It wouldn't do for him to let all this time go to waste after all. Considering that his current allies were 4 such super hollows that one served the man he'd come to recognize as his newest true enemy, he figured he was off to an interesting start at least. As it were, Aizen had taken quite the gamble. The attack on his person 100 years ago had not only proven that Aizen knew about Naruto's investigation into his actions, but that Naruto had been getting far too close for comfort. It had been his mistake to act without enough information on Naruto's abilities at the time. As a result he made a miscalculation and lost one of his strongest soldiers, along with her servants. As a result of Aizen's mistake, Naruto had been able to train and prepare under the radar. Neither Sarate or Aizen was aware of his continued existence in the world of the living. It had been necessary, though perhaps a little cold of him, to convince those precious to him that he'd been destroyed in that battle. It was however the only option available to him. There was no way of knowing how much dirt Aizen could have on any of them. Had he tried to bring the schemer's actions to light, he could very well have been painted as a villain himself. Having something like that happen to any of those close to him just hadn't been an option. It had been his first meeting with his current allies and now friends that had offered him the opening he'd been looking for. Of course, being who he was, this new relationship started out as many of those in his past had. With a bang. Uber long flashback of doom. 110 years ago. A wave of bright yellow energy slammed into him with the force of an angry giant, battering into his body and dragging him across the earth at least 36 yards before slamming him into the trees at the edge of the clearing. The explosion that followed was deafening, and by the time the roar of the flames quieted, his ears were ringing, and it felt as if his head was playing host to thousands of tiny drummers, all beating against the inside of his skull. That may have been because he'd smoked his head on a rather stubborn rock on his trip across the clearing, or maybe the force of the attack had rattled him just that much. Regardless, these sensations only lasted for about a moment before a new sensation began to dominate his senses. It was hot, and unbearably so. He was also buried in what felt like several tons of felled and burning lumber. He would need to rectify that so that he could focus on more pressing issues. Such as the ones who had attacked him. So with a mighty push, he sent the crushed timber flying away from him and through the air in splintered shards that rained down upon the earth below in a hail of burning kindling. With a pained grunt, he stood from the pile of debris and burning wood and gave himself a quick once-over. He appeared relatively unharmed, apart from the bleeding gash over his brow. The blood from his wound streaming down his face in thick rivulets, dripping from his chin and staining the blasted earth beneath his feet as he walked out of the flames. His assailants were instantly on guard as he emerged from the smoke, his strides measured and confident, even though his haori had been nearly obliterated and his fishnet shirt was left in tatters. The only articles of clothing to come out of that encounter relatively whole were his sandals and hakama, though one of his sandals was missing, oddly enough. In short, he looked like a bum dressed in rags, a far sight from the dignified and almost regal appearance he'd sported before he'd been blown sky high. Twice. Stopping several meters away from the four women in the strange white garb, Naruto spit a glob of blood to the side, running his tongue around his teeth to make sure none had been knocked loose or broken. With his inspection done, Naruto reached behind him and drew his wakizashi, the broken halves of the scabbard, falling to the dirt behind him as he did so, seemingly only having been holding on by a thread that had finally snapped as he'd drawn the blade. Raising his free hand to his neck, Naruto gripped his nape tightly and tilted his head to the left. A sharp crack followed the action, and a rather annoying kink that had been bothering him faded. He then used his pinky finger to clean out his left ear, wiggling it about in an attempt to alleviate the high-pitched ringing that was still assailing him. A muffled voice from the group in front of him forced his attention back upwards, and towards one of the women in particular. She was the shorter of the group, standing at 150 centimeters thereabout, with long olive green hair, long eyelashes and lavender eyes. There were 3 pink teardrops under her right eye and 3 bone-like hair clips on the bangs to the right of her face. She was garbed in a long white dress, which seemed to be the color of the day, with long sleeves extending well past the tips of her fingers. There were 2 crisscrossing belts about her slender waist, and if she was wearing any footwear then he couldn't see it. She was saying something, but since his head was still ringing he couldn't make out a word of it. It was like trying to listen to someone talking to you when you were standing under a waterfall, which was impossible and annoying. There were 3 others as well, another girl standing only a few inches taller than the first, with short black hair and a bob cut and heterochromatic eyes, the right being blue, while her left was amber and painted with a thick red eyeliner. She was wearing a white kimono and hakama, the kimono having shoulder-length sleeves and black cuffs, a V-neck top with a high collar, and black bands around her wrists. There was some sort of bone fragment decorating her hair, set in the middle of her bangs, and extending toward the back of her head with a single horn pointing forward. Strange headwear to be sure, but to each their own. Wherever these people came from it must have been a common fashion accessory, who knew? The others were quite a bit taller than the first 2, the first of these being a dark-skinned woman with long, wavy brown hair and an impressive bust, standing at 177 centimeters. She had what appeared to be a 3-section crown on her head and a thick necklace about her neck. Both of these items were seemingly made of the same bone-like material as the hair clips the other 2 were wearing. Like the others, she was also wearing all white, a corset-like top and short white pleated skirt with 2 white cloth bracers on her forearms. The last, however, was the one that had Naruto's more immediate attention. From what he could sense of her reiatsu, she was easily the most powerful of the group, her presence in the area making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. She too was a dark-skinned woman wearing white. She stood at least as tall as the other woman, but unlike the others he couldn't see any bone fragments. She was dressed in a white top that left her abdomen bare, covering the upper half of its Tsunade-level bust up to the lower half of her face, though short on her torso. It had a pair of long sleeves with black glove-like extensions that reminded him of a cat's paws. The top itself had a zipper in the center that seemed at first glance to open upwards, instead of the more traditional zippers in the human world that opened downwards. Her legs were adorned with an altered white hakama that bared a good portion of the smooth caramel skin of her thighs, held up by a black sash around her hips, with a pair of simple straw sandals on her feet. She had short messy blonde hair with 3 braided locks, blonde eyebrows, and thick blonde eyelashes over vibrant aquamarine eyes. which were currently regarding him coolly, yet warily. She was the only one who had drawn her weapon, a short sword with a curved guard and pommel. The blade itself was a double-edged broadsword, only about the length of his forearm, with a distinct lack of a fuller. As in the entirety of the blade where the fuller would normally be, was simply gone, making the sword hollow. A strange weapon indeed, but apparently quite effective at launching waves of energy at unsuspecting individuals who had been about to go to bed. How rude. All in all though, she was as beautiful as any kunoichi or shinigami he'd ever seen in his existence, though his appreciation was marred by the fact she'd just attacked him. Then there was the fact he'd nearly overlooked before, the other dark-skinned woman was sporting a hole. Not just any hole either, but one that went straight through her body, visible just beneath the cleft of her breasts. Telling him one thing without a shadow of a doubt. Hollows. Break. Perspective change. Here Harribel calmly looked over the burning wreckage of what was once a beautiful homestead, regretful of the fact that she had been ordered to destroy it and the person living there. In her mind such beautiful scenery should be preserved at all costs, and to destroy it was simply a crime against nature. Orders were orders though, and she could complain about it all she wanted later, if of course that was her wish, and seeing as she wasn't one to complain about anything that seemed highly unlikely. When she had been given the order she had been thoroughly confused, as she had thought Aizen wanted to keep the majority of his plans quiet until the time was right. Why then order one of his most powerful espada to reveal themselves in Soul Society of all places, all for the sake of eliminating one Shinigami? The explanation she had been given was that he was getting far too close to discovering his true plans than was acceptable. He needed to be terminated before he could jeopardize everything Aizen had worked so hard to build up to this point. That in itself was understandable, but she could also sense a fear in Aizen, something she had almost written off as nothing due to having never felt such strong feelings from their leader since having met him all those years ago. In the end though, she could only conclude that their leader, who had seemed to be without peer, was afraid of this Shinigami. When the man leaped from the burning wreckage and Harribel got a look at him, her eyebrows shot into her hairline in surprise. He was a handsome individual for sure, but that wasn't what surprised her. She couldn't sense him. She could see him in front of her eyes, but she felt nothing of his reiatsu. She hadn't even known he was inside the house, her thinking being that perhaps she could draw him out by destroying the building itself. Surprisingly enough, while her first attack had managed to fulfill its intended purpose of drawing him out, it had also caught her target in the blast. What was the most disconcerting however, was that he was completely unharmed, looking for all the world that the assassination attempt hadn't bothered him in the slightest, and he'd been more annoyed at the loss of his house than anything else. She watched as he checked himself over, while a myriad of thoughts ran through her head a mile a minute. It was inconceivable, not only was she unable to properly judge his strength, but it would appear that he was actually strong enough to survive an explosion of that magnitude, with nary a scratch. Impossible. That blast would have been strong enough to harm even one of the higher-ranked espada. Steeling herself, she motioned for those with her to follow her before moving off in a burst of sonido. She came to a landing behind the man, already drawing back her Zanpakuto and filling it with her dense yellow Ryukyu as he turned his head towards her, having heard her arrival and that of her frakcion behind her. I have to be quick and catch him off guard. I'll put everything I have into this and make sure he stays down. I loathe fighting so dishonorably, but I don't have much choice. Just who did you send me to eliminate, Aizen? He locked eyes with her for only a moment before she swung her sword in a broad sweep and unleashed her signature technique, a technique known as Ul Azul. Normally the actual attack would look more like a blade of pure energy, this time however, she had pumped so much of her Ryukyu into the technique it resembled a golden tidal wave. The attack seemed to have surprised the man, Tyr noted, as she'd barely been able to see the slight widening of his eyes before his form had been enveloped by her supercharged technique. The wave tore through the earth as it traveled across the clearing before making impact with a thick corpse of trees at the other side of the lake and exploding violently as the energy made contact and was released. Dust and flaming debris flew into the sky before raining down around them, and not long after the impact that had sent several of the massive trees sprawling into the woods or splashing down into the lake, several of these large trees fell over themselves in an attempt to bury the man responsible for slamming into them. For several tense moments they waited as the dust slowly cleared and the flames calmed to a dull roar. Tyr could only hope that had done it, and this battle was over before it had a chance to begin. Her frakcion were apparently being of the same mind, as Apache laughed about seeing the look on the man's face before he'd been obliterated in the blast. Did you see his face? Apache howled before devolving into new bouts of almost hysterical laughter, holding on to her stomach as she nearly doubled over in misplaced humor. Tyr had been about to sheath her sword when a new explosion made her look back towards the burning pile of felled trees and timber, instantly silencing her frakcion. This one had not been the result of a technique, but the result of massive force. Charred timber simply shattered in the face of such force, sending countless bits of flaming debris into the air, each one trailing fire and smoke as they fell around them like rain. Wearily, Tyr kept her eyes trained on the cloud of dust and smoke that was currently obscuring her vision, waiting to see what she was sure she would, and only a moment later, she saw the form of the man she'd just watched get blown away by her overpowered Ola Azul, calmly walking through the veil of smoke and dust. His once pristine red haori now little more than a tattered shawl about his shoulders, and his fishnet shirt completely shredded, only a few strands of the fiber remaining on his torso in a tangled mess. His hakama was largely untouched, and he was missing a sandal, yet still he seemed relatively unharmed save for the gash on his forehead. "What in the hell are you made of?" Apache muttered in disbelief. Sung Sun frowned. "He does appear no worse for wear." The group's sweat dropped however, when instead of regarding them as any kind of threat, the man spat a glob of blood to the side, gripped his neck and tilted his head to the side as he drew his sword, eliciting a loud crack that even they could hear from where they were standing, before he started trying to clean out his ear with his pinky. Scrunching up his face at the feeling while visibly running his tongue over his teeth. My, you're awfully carefree aren't you Shinigami-san?" The man looked up at them then, studying them before he smacked the side of his head repeatedly. Blinking confusedly at the man's behavior, the three Frakcions simply continued staring at him as he tilted his head to the side and gave himself a few good thumps. Apache snarled, "Oi, take this seriously you dim-witted bastard." Mila Rose who had been silent up to now crossed her arms beneath her bust and sighed. "I had thought he was going to be more impressive than this. I mean, if Aizen-sama sent us here to take him down because he was a threat to the plan, wouldn't he have to be at least moderately intelligent? Sure he seems sturdy enough, but this man is clearly an idiot." Finally the man stood to his full height and regarded them with a frown, before taking a deep breath and then shaking his head. Sung Sun lifted her hand, hiding her mouth behind her sleeve. "Are you ready to take us seriously now Shinigami-san?" "What?" The man yelled loudly, startling the three of them. His voice had been so loud they were sure the people in the town across the forest had heard him. Getting over her shock Sung Sun tried again, a little louder this time. "I sigh. You have to speak up. I can't hear you." The man articulated this point by gesturing to his ears and lifting a palm towards the sky to indicate raising the volume at which they spoke. The three Frakcion fell flat on their faces, so shocked at his statement that they had tripped from a standing position, while Tyr simply raised a brow, clearly bemused with the entire situation. Now it was the man's turn to look at them oddly, while simply standing there in his ruined clothing. First they attacked him, then they do a simultaneous face plant. Why were people in the afterlife so much stranger than he was used to? Sure things could get crazy in the elemental nations, but this was just plain weird. Sung Sun sighed almost tiredly before turning to their mistress Harribel. "May we start now Harribel-sama? Talking will obviously get us nowhere if he can't hear a word we are saying." Harribel shook her head exasperatedly, before looking at the man and nodding. "We weren't sent here to talk in any case, just be careful." "Alright. You're going down you empty-headed twit." Apache crowed with a large sadistic smile. Naruto shook his head, and his frown deepened. "You really need to speak up. I can't hear a word you just said." "Oh forget it." Apache screamed in frustration as the three Frakcion burst into motion. "Forget, who shit." Naruto dashed out of the way as Apache came flying down at him, her leg extended in a signature axe kick, and when her heel connected with the ground where he'd been standing, that patch of earth was completely obliterated. The impact lifting a cloud of dust and earth and debris into the air around her and momentarily obscuring her from view. Before long she re-emerged from the dust cloud, as if she'd been shot from a cannon and jumped into another kick, this one a drop kick aimed at his face. To his eyes, the motions were incredibly slow, and getting himself out of harm's way was as simple as leaning his head a little to the left. Her heel grazed his cheek, but she made a mistake and overextended, so he capitalized and took a firm hold of her ankle, before spinning once on his heel and releasing his hold, sending her flying through the air like a discus in an uncontrolled spin. Mila Rose was the next to strike, but unlike Apache, she had drawn her broadsword and aimed to take off his head. Bringing up his Zanpakuto, Naruto deflected the blow above his head, letting her heavier blade skitter off to the side and throw her off balance. His next move was to deliver a solid fist just beneath her hollow hull, coincidentally being right where her diaphragm should be. The blow was strong enough to lift the woman's feet off the ground, spittle and blood bursting from her mouth as she was sent flying away from her now more coherent opponent. Sung Sun and Apache had stopped, looking back as Mila Rose flew past them and crashed into the lake with a splash, skipping along the water before ultimately flying into the treeline with a mighty crash, acting the part of a pinball for a moment as she broke through the trunks of several trees. Their trunks having been completely shattered by the impact, these sturdy wooden giants all toppled down atop the felled arrancar, adding more sound to the already noisy symphony of clashing steel and raging infernos. Looking back at the man, they bore witness to a hard glare with an intensity unlike any they'd ever seen. "I think you all need to cool off." Harribel frowned. She knew this man was strong, but to actually wound an arrancar, even one of the weaker ones, with nothing but his bare fist was a feat only some of the more powerful arrancars and Shinigami could ever boast. An arrancar's hero was usually strong enough to deflect even his Anpakuto, yet he'd punched Mila Rose and actually hurt her. Deflecting some admittedly powerful blows with masterful ease and actually managing to counterattack while being attacked by several opponents without the use of one of his senses. She prepared to attack herself as Naruto moved, slowly at first, drawing his sword back in a reverse grip and holding it behind him as he entered a pseudo-runner's pose. "Allow me to help you all blow off some steam," Naruto grumbled before it turned into a growl. "Well, I pay you back for destroying my house." Suddenly, he vanished, disappearing with insane speed that none present could follow. When he reappeared, his leg was drawn back and his body spun into a powerful roundhouse, powered by his considerable strength and the speed of his shunpo, that caught Itachi in the abdomen with interest. The blow slammed into her with the force of a speeding train, folding her around his leg and sending her flying back into Sung-sun, the both of them crumpling to the ground in a twisted heap of tangled limbs, groaning, and unladylike cursing. With them taken care of, Naruto turned his attention to where Harribel was now dashing towards him, sword drawn back, but without the yellow energy from before filling the hollow of the blade this time. It was a normal swing, and he had to quickly bring his sword up to the side to block the powerful slash that was aiming to bisect him at the waist. With a thunderous crash their swords met, turning the earth beneath his feet to mulch from the force and sending the dislodged dirt and stone flying out behind him in a massive wave. The shockwave generated by the impact being strong enough to knock the newly risen Sung-sun off her feet and tumbling across the clearing like a rag doll, and actually put out part of the fire consuming his former place of residence. Harribel had seen enough. This man was far too powerful for her frakcion to even dream of fighting as they were. She needed to end this quickly, since more Shinigami were undoubtedly on their way. To that end, she decided to attack, but had hit something of a snag. Locking blades, she suddenly realized that he was much stronger than her. While her sword arm was shaking with the strain, his own wasn't even twitching. Both of their expressions were calm and composed, but his eyes held a fire in them that made Harribel nervous. While he was truly calm, Harribel's was only a facade at this point, realizing with a sudden clarity that she was simply no match for this man. "What kind of enemy have you made, Aizen-sama? It's almost like..." Her thoughts were cut short as Naruto lifted his free hand, his fingers forming some sort of hand seal, before a single whirl turned her world on its head. Kai. All of a sudden, a great pressure fell about the area, falling on her shoulders with such weight that her knees had very nearly buckled beneath her. Her normally stoic demeanor changing to one of complete shock as the massive force pressed down on her and made it difficult to breathe. Almost like fighting the Primera. With force far greater than it appeared, Naruto twisted his sword against hers until he had it positioned diagonally and then swung up and outwards. The action sent Harribel tumbling back along the ground in an uncontrolled roll. Realizing she had to get herself back on her feet and quickly, she planted her feet against the ground and drove her sword into the earth beneath her. Slowly her momentum began to bleed off and she began to slow. When Harribel managed to halt her backwards movement and steady herself, she was afraid she had taken a second too long and would look up and find her opponent right on top of her and rearing back for a finishing blow. When she did look up, she was surprised to see that he hadn't moved an inch, and so she took the opportunity presented by this development to school her expression and stand up straight, staring straight into his eyes with whatever courage she could muster. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was really just a few moments, several meters apart, observing the other's stance and searching for openings, or in Naruto's case, simply waiting for her to make a move while thinking about what questions he wanted answered first. After several long minutes, Harribel shot forward, her sword once again drawn back behind her in preparation to swing. Naruto quickly raised his own blade across his body to knock the swing back, before stepping into her guard and hitting her in the stomach with a powerful palm strike. Her eyes widened upon feeling the strength behind the blow. Already she could feel it turning into an ugly bruise on top of having also knocked the air from her lungs. The force once again sent her rocketing backwards, sliding back along the ground and tearing two small trenches into the earth with her heels as she tried to slow her momentum, but this time Naruto followed her, keeping close and raising his sword to once again deflect her attempt at a rebuke, the force of which keeping her momentum constant and making her arm go numb. She continued to slide backwards for some time before finally coming to a stop against part of the wall that had once surrounded his compound. Looking back momentarily to see just what had stopped her, she took only a moment to recognize the wall, before returning her gaze to the man currently flying straight towards her in a mad dash. Suddenly he jumped into the air, coming down towards her in an arc with his fist drawn back. Quickly using Sunito to get out of the way, Harribel was glad she did, as when he came down to earth and slammed his fist into the wall where her head would have been, the solid stone wall completely exploded. Parts of the wall flying about in every direction before a sudden shift in the wind sent the shards of rock flying straight at Harribel. Eyes going wide in surprise as the very wind launched hundreds of small but still dangerous projectiles her way, Harribel acted quickly and launched a quick ul Azul into the cloud of projectiles and towards Naruto who was still behind them. When her ul Azul was cut in half by what appeared to be an invisible blade, Naruto appeared in the space created by the phenomena, already in the middle of a quick dash towards her. Speaking of dashing, how is he keeping up with me? He hasn't once used Shunpo, yet I've been utilizing Sunito almost repeatedly. Her moment for thought however ended when his fist was planted into her stomach. Her eyes went almost impossibly wide, she had been staring right at him. When did he so now he uses Shunpo? Looking at the Naruto that she had been watching initially, she noticed that form flicker and vanish like an illusion, as the Naruto who currently had his fist planted in her gut pulled her through the air, using her like a battering ram against the trees in the forest, before extending his arm in an improvised throw and launching her back down to earth in the middle of the clearing. The earth cratered, cracks forming around the newest indentation littering the clearing, as her body made impact with the earth with startling force. It was then that for a moment all was quiet, the ringing of blade striking blade no longer filling the air, along with the sounds of explosions and the static of Sunito. As Harribel tried to force herself to her feet, her body aching from the beating she'd just taken, Naruto appeared out of a Shunpo not far from her, his sword held lazily at his side as he regarded her with hard eyes. "Are you done?" Naruto asked calmly. Harribel had finally managed to regain her feet and was now standing on shaking legs. He was infinitely stronger than she was, that much was obvious. Their earlier exchange having proven to her that he was very likely on the level of Coyote Sterk. If that was the case then to continue would be suicide, even if she were to use her resurrection. This man had yet to even utilize his Shikai, and it was then she had a sobering thought. What if this man had obtained his Bankai? If that was the case, then were she to continue, then he could very easily destroy her, should he use either of his Zanpakuto's released states. But the nod from Harribel in affirmation, Naruto shook his head, and then both simply waited. Finally, after several long moments of silence, Naruto spoke. "Aizen sent you, didn't he, Espada?" Harribel frowned, trying her best not to appear perturbed at the fact he even knew of the Espada, the top tier of Aizen's army. Then again Aizen himself had said that this man knew too much, and seeing as to how she had been unwittingly sent to die, she saw no reason not to answer him, if giving him this information would spare the lives of at least her frakcion. Something she would make sure to ask of him before he likely killed her. She nodded after a moment and her frown receded. "He did, you know too much, Shinigami-san," and Aizen-sama felt the need to correct that. Naruto smirked, obviously seeing some humor in the notion that he'd apparently had Aizen on the rope so to speak. Then again, how Aizen had realized that Naruto had been watching him was what really had Naruto stumped, he'd been certain that his seals were working flawlessly. Then again, Yamamoto had been able to sense his Ryukyu as well. Looks like he would need to tweak his seals a bit. Taking a glance at his obliterated home, Naruto added another point on his Fuinjutsu to-do list. Gotta perfect the seals on the house too, an attack of that strength shouldn't have so much as scratched the wall. Gonna have to get my hands on some Siki stone to use as a reference. Now if Aizen knew about him spying on him, then that meant Naruto had lost one of his advantages, the element of surprise as it were. There was unfortunately no way save one of regaining that advantage in this secret war of theirs, and Aizen's awareness would make it impossible for him to gather any new information on his movements, so there was unfortunately nothing he could do about that. Aizen apparently wanted him dead, so why not give him what he wanted? Allow him a false sense of security and hide away somewhere out of the way. Some place Aizen would never think to look. It was going to be difficult to fool Aizen, since Naruto was well aware of how intelligent the man was, but if his imperfect seals could hide his reiatsu from specialized detectors and sensors, then hiding wouldn't be too much of an issue once they had been perfected. Naruto's frown deepened. He didn't like where his own thoughts were going, but the idea had merit. Well, he still had one advantage, being that Aizen had no idea how strong he truly was. That would change the second this woman returned and reported her failure. Though killing her wasn't an option either, it just didn't seem right to him, which meant he was in something of a bind. Why couldn't he have been more like his mentors? Those shinobi that were capable of closing off their emotions from the task at hand, cold, efficient, and utterly ruthless. He could also simply take this arrancar to the Sirite and have her testify against Aizen, but Yamamoto was a little too strict for that to work. The second he sensed a hollow within Sirite as powerful as the woman in front of him, he'd destroy her himself without waiting to hear an explanation. Stubborn old coot. Looks like plan A will have to suffice. Now he just needed to get himself out of the situation. Well then, we appear to be in a little situation here. You can't beat me, but if I were to kill you and return to Sirte, there's nothing to stop Aizen from sending a more powerful arrancar next time to finish the job. I'm also not too keen on him figuring out how powerful I am, there's a reason I hide my reiatsu most of the time after all. So hollow, wait a minute. Naruto sighed, lowering his sword to his side and brushing his bangs out of his face. It would be awful rude of me to keep calling you hollow. Does my opponent have a name? Harribel raised an eyebrow, also lowering her sword for the moment as Naruto's reiatsu began to weaken until it was barely there, allowing for a more comfortable atmosphere, even if they were surrounded by flames, uprooted trees, and the other results of their admittedly short bout. The fact he would even think to ask her name, when no Shinigami had ever cared to ask for the name of a hollow before, had actually surprised her. Most Shinigami simply found it easier to purify them as soon as possible, rather than try to make conversation with them apart from issuing threats. Such pleasantries between a hollow and a Shinigami were practically unheard of, though she did find herself answering. Here reached up to her jacket, taking hold of the zipper and opening the article of clothing. When the Gothic number 3 was revealed, so too was her mask, the shark-like face mask covering her nose and mouth, lined with a row of jagged teeth, the plate extended down, covering her neck and collarbone, while 2 plates came down over her breasts to cover her nipples. The Gothic-styled 3 was tattooed in black on her right breast. "Tres espada, Tier Harribel." She spoke ominously, yet at this point she knew it wasn't going to so much as startle him, let alone frighten him as it would normally. Closing her jacket once more to hide her mask fragments, Harribel gazed calmly at the man before her and waited. Naruto chuckled quietly, moving to sheath his sword and only succeeding in slicing off a piece of his hakama. He then remembered that his sheath had been broken in that second attack and smiled sheepishly. "Forgot you broke my scabbard, Harribel-san." So, he tossed his sword into the dirt at his feet, the blade easily sinking into the earth about halfway, before he introduced himself. "My name is Namikaze Naruto, first generational head of the Namikaze noble family, third seat of the Naibantai and commander of the Onmitsukido. A pleasure to meet you, I guess, Harribel-san." But the introduction out of the way, Naruto was reminded of a particular conversation he had overheard one day where this particular hollow's name had been mentioned. Naruto then realized just how fortuitous his day had just gotten. Aizen had not only supplied him with a way to gain the upper hand in this little struggle of theirs, but he'd also unwittingly provided him with a way to weaken his own standing forces without having to bloody his hands. "Harribel-san, why do you fight for Aizen? What has he done to make you and your underlings so loyal to him?" Harribel frowned, having her reasons for fighting questioned was one thing, but her loyalty to Aizen was paramount. She owed him a life debt after all, and she took such things very seriously. "He saved the lives of myself and my frakcion from an arrancar that had disobeyed his orders and attacked us. I owe him my life, Namikaze-san, and I do not forget my debts." Naruto nodded, having heard that part of Aizen's plan, before he sighed. This could either go really well or really badly, it was a good thing he liked people like her. "What would you do if I told you that you had been deceived, Harribel-san? That Aizen hadn't actually saved you out of any form of goodwill, but only because you were strong enough to warrant his attention. That he hadn't actually saved you at all." Harribel's gaze was suddenly murderous. Her reiatsu becoming wild and angry as she stalked forward, Naruto not moving as she did. "Do not speak ill of Aizen-sama." Naruto cringed a bit at the potency of her reiatsu and cleared his throat nervously. Women themselves could be rather frightening when they were angry, mind you, he had plenty of experience dealing with some of the most fearsome Kunoichi in the elemental nations. Now that he was in Sirte, the titles may have changed, but in the end it seemed he was destined to be surrounded by women that could level skyscrapers with ease. "I have proof that Aizen was merely leading you along. He took advantage of your honorable nature to force your loyalty and is merely using you. To him you are nothing but a tool to be used and then discarded when he finds you no longer useful." Harribel stopped then, leering at him with sharp eyes as a feeling of doubt started welling up in her breast. "What proof, Shinigami?" Naruto let out a breath of relief, seeing that she had at least decided to hear what he had to say before restarting their bout. That could have gone south rather quickly, and he really needed to get moving before his plan failed before he could even leave. Reaching across his chest, noticing that his Haori had fallen from his shoulders at some point in their little bout, or the remains of it anyway, Naruto pressed his fingers against the seal on his left bicep, and in a small flash of light, he had the files containing all the data gathered during his investigation on Aizen in his hand. "Within these files is everything I've gathered on Aizen, within them is the proof you want. I will give it to you for a small price." The suspicion in Harribel's eyes then was obvious. Who knew what kind of thought such a statement would evoke? What kind of price? Naruto shrugged. "Place your loyalty somewhere it won't be betrayed, use your power to fight for something actually worthwhile, for such an honorable soul as yourself, fighting for a slime ball like Aizen is hardly fitting. You don't need to like me, hell hate me for all I care, but I'm asking you to trust me just this once, not as a Shinigami, but as Namikaze Naruto. If you don't find enough of a reason to say to hell with Aizen within these files, you can simply walk away. I won't stop you, even though it'll throw a major wrench into my plans. My price Harribel-san is for you to leave Aizen's army and do whatever it is you want to do with this afterlife of yours. Searching through the files, he finally found the one he was looking for labeled arrancar experiments and held it out towards Harribel while sealing the others back into his arm. Read the first page, there's enough there for you to understand why I'm saying this, but we don't have enough time to let you read any more of it at the moment. More Shinigami will be arriving here any second. Harribel stepped closer cautiously before reaching out and taking the file from his hand. He didn't move to strike her, he simply stood there, lowering his arm as the file was taken from him. Sheathing Tiburon, she opened the file to the first page. At the very top of the page it gave a small description of the file's contents before it evolved into a very descriptive report on a conversation overheard between Aizen and another man she knew as Kanem Tausen. Above the text detailing this conversation was a small series of kanji arranged to form a single kanji. Channel some reiatsu into that symbol there Harribel, it's a seal that records sounds, like voices. Text alone wouldn't be enough to convince anyone really, and unfortunately even with the voice recorded Aizen wasn't being specific enough for it to count as any sort of solid proof. I would be ignored to tell you the truth, all because Soul Society knows next to nothing about these seals I use. They have no knowledge of them to fall back on, so it would be easy for Aizen to fabricate a lie to turn the situation around on me. As far as anyone listening would be concerned, I could have made a seal with a false recording. Doing as instructed, Harribel suddenly heard Aizen's voice speaking the words written on the page. The conversation went over the different traits of a soul named Harribel they'd become interested in, a powerful soul they wanted to retrieve for unspoken reasons. This particular soul had apparently befriended 3 others that also possessed great potential. It then went into a brief description of her habits and personalities, detailing reasons for why they would serve useful to the organization they served, or more specifically Aizen and his organization. The conversation was indeed vague, obviously because Aizen had been in Soul Society. It did however allude to what had happened that day Harribel had decided to join Aizen. They spoke of how he had given that Hollow Harribel had attacked at Baragon's palace the power he wanted for his revenge. Knowingly granting this Hollow the power he needed to defeat her and her frakcion, even though he'd told her it had acted without his consent, all this so that he could appear just before it struck the finishing blow. Like a knight in shining armor, arriving at the last moment to save the damsels in distress and win their undying loyalty and devotion. The plan had served 2 purposes however, and it had been masterfully executed, seeing as how it had actually worked. Aizen had won her loyalty, even getting so much as an oath of fealty from her, thanks to the life debt she now owed him. He had also been able to display his own strength in an effort to show his superiority, eliminating any thoughts of future rebellion, and showing them that if he had wanted to he could easily destroy them regardless of their answer. Hearing all of this though had ignited the flame of rage in Harribel, fueled by her own correct conclusions that she had come to after listening to his words as he quite simply stated how little she actually meant to his plans and that her loss and that of her frakcion, if he'd failed to save them in time, wouldn't have meant much in the end since he could just use another Hollow. That he'd overestimated her abilities if she couldn't survive against such a weak experiment long enough for him to arrive. They were all simply numbers to him, one Hollow making no difference from another. Her gaze had darkened ominously at the last statement especially, the sound of grinding teeth accompanying the shaking of her hands as she gripped the file angrily, nearly ripping it in half. She had been played. He tricked all of us. All 3 of us were fooled by that gentle countenance, a facade to conceal the snake of a man that he truly is. That bastard. Practically ordering my death just so that he could use me. I knew that Arrancar had been about to say something along those lines back then before Aizen cut him down. How could I have been so stupid to have not seen it? Naruto looked at the shaking woman solemnly, not regretting for even a moment telling her the truth of the man she practically revered. Hers had been a case that Naruto had felt genuine anger about, having something similar happen to him while he was alive so long ago. They were quite similar all truth told, both having their loyalty abused for the gain of others before being betrayed in the worst way possible by someone they had looked up to. Naruto had lost a friend because of it, and Harribel had nearly lost those she held dear because of a madman's scheming. I'm sorry Harribel-san, I truly am. Naruto stated calmly. Aizen has actually done us both a favor by sending you here, seeing as how I was able to reveal the truth to you, but I really must go now, if I linger any longer I won't be able to get the upper hand on Aizen, and he will continue to be in control of the situation. You may do what you like, but I would recommend making yourself scarce. Leave Aizen to me and go someplace safe where he won't be able to find you. You know what kind of man Aizen is now, so you know if he realizes you've betrayed him that you won't survive long. Harribel looked up then, her darkened gaze piercing into his soul as she looked into his eyes. She was searching for any hint of deceit, anything to tell her that he too was simply playing with her. When she found none, Harribel forced herself to calm down, her reiatsu calming and finally becoming bearable for her only conscious frakcion. "I will join you, Naruto-san." Naruto nodded. "That's good, now I really must beg your pardon." He looked over at her owlishly, and since he'd been a quarter of the way to picking up his sword before her statement, the action had looked rather comical. Harribel closed the file and walked up to Naruto until she was standing less than a foot from him, looking up into his eyes and noting his confusion. Noting idly that even bending down as he was still just barely taller than her. "I will join you, if you are fighting against Aizen then it would be best that you did not do so alone. He is gathering an army as you most likely know already, so facing him alone would do nothing but see you quickly overwhelmed." Besides, Harribel handed the folder back to Naruto as he gripped his sword, pulling it from the ground and receiving the file with his other hand before standing up straight as Harribel turned away from him. "I will see Aizen destroyed for playing with my loyalty like this, and wasn't it you that told me to place my loyalty somewhere it wouldn't be betrayed? I may not know you well, but I feel in you a kindred spirit, you will not betray me." There was that infamous and completely terrifying righteous feminine fury that men the world over feared. At this point Naruto was actually starting to worry about Aizen, the poor bastard's plotting was gearing up to bite him in the ass or kick him in balls. Depends on your point of view really. Naruto blinked, looking down at the folder in his hand completely dumbstruck. How the hell did I not see that one coming? Sealing the file and his sword back into his arm Naruto frowned, suddenly getting serious. "If you're coming with me, then hurry and gather your friends. I'll need to apply seals on you to hide your reiatsu so that we can get into the Sirte undetected. There are a few things we'll need before we can leave, and the Sirte is unfortunately the only place we can acquire them. It's also the only way out of Soul Society." "Why would you need to be undetected?" Harribel asked, a brow raised in question. Naruto smiled sadly. "As far as anyone who knows me will be concerned, you killed me today Harribel, and as far as Aizen is concerned, we killed each other in our battle here." Harribel nodded at that answer and moved to make her way to her frakcion before a small burst of static announced the arrival of said frakcion, Sung-sun having appeared carrying both of her fellow frakcion on her shoulders. "I brought the others when I felt your battle reach its conclusion Harribel-sama, now we should." Stopping mid-sentence when she noticed Naruto standing there, Harribel palmed her face as the young arrancar dropped her companions roughly and drew her sigh. "Harribel-sama, why is he still alive Sung-sun?" Harribel finished for her. "Due to some unforeseen circumstances, we will be joining him. I will explain it later, but for now I'll simply state that Aizen played us all for fools." Sung-sun looked utterly confused but nodded at her mistress's words before putting her sigh away. This spoke much of her devotion to the woman if she was so willing to stand down in the face of what had been an enemy only minutes ago. But that little bit of unpleasantness out of the way, Naruto got started on applying the seals to their bodies, keeping it to just 3 for now. 2 on their wrists and 1 on their collarbones above their breasts. Sung-sun had actually giggled while he did this, apparently being quite ticklish, while Harribel hadn't made a sound, simply offering the body parts he requested and holding perfectly still so that he could finish quickly. Once done, Naruto picked up the one named Mila Rose before motioning to his newest companions. He could sense the reiatsu of several captains and another Shinigami quickly approaching them and needed to get them out of here before they arrived lest they be found. He'd already activated the seals so they shouldn't be able to sense them, but they could still see them. His heart was already beginning to ache now that he could recognize the Shinigami quickly making their way towards them. What he was about to do would no doubt hurt them a great deal, and if there was one thing Naruto hated to do it was hurt those he loved. Having a friend die on you was never easy to bear, and that's exactly what he wanted them to think. Harribel picked up Apache and followed Incenito as Naruto used Shunpo to vacate the area, moving quickly and quietly on a path that would lead them around the approaching Shinigami and towards the Sirte. They would only be there for a matter of minutes, but Naruto had changed his mind and told them along the way to wait within District 1 until he returned. It would be too difficult to sneak 4 people inside the Sirte if the alarms were blaring like they were. It was very likely that the entirety of the city was swarming with Shinigami by now. The larger the group, the larger their chances of being seen. While Harribel and her frakcion slipped into a broken-down storage shed in the district, Naruto left Mila Rose with them, gently handing her over to Harribel after she'd put Apache down on the floor. He then assured them he would be back shortly before making his way out of the district and heading straight for the Sirte. Break. Perspective change. It hadn't taken him long to reach the Sirte, and Naruto was counting his lucky stars that they hadn't lowered the walls, which would make his entry an infinitely more difficult affair. Once inside, Naruto had first made his way to the Junobantai barracks, swiping about a half a dozen Gigai and making sure to alter the records so that it didn't look suspicious. He then did the same for a case of Gaiken and a few Denrishinki as well as Kikenshinki just in case, before making his way out of the barracks and heading towards the Nibantai compound. He needed clothing since he was only half dressed at the moment and it was the only place he kept spare clothes in case he needed a fresh set. He was in and out in under 10 seconds, entering through the window of his bedroom and going straight to the wardrobe. He took only 3 sets so that it didn't look strange if searched and put them away in one of the many storage seals on his body before making his way back out the window and into the night. He stuck to the shadows, keeping low and quiet as he made his way back to District 1 and the waiting arrancar. He was honestly surprised that Harribel had trusted him so quickly. He'd simply expected her to vow her feminine justice on Aizen for abusing her trust and that of her friends and then go on her merry way. He didn't expect for her to place her loyalty or her trust in him. She would definitely bear watching, since this could all just be a plot to catch him off guard again. That last time had hurt like a bitch, so he was in no rush to experience it again. Once he'd made his way back to the large storage shed, Naruto entered through the heavy doors, only to be met by silence. Looking about in confusion, he finally saw Harribel standing at the back of the building with her arms crossed under her breasts. She was staring at him intently upon his entry, but said nothing until he'd made his way over to her. Looking down, he noticed Sung-sun busily fretting over the still unconscious pair of arrancar. Must have hit them a little too hard. Turning his attention back to the still silent Harribel, Naruto nodded once. We should be ready to go. I was hoping they would be awake to walk themselves. It'll be harder to sneak over to the official Sinkamen with a pair of unconscious bodies, but we'll have to make do, I guess. One of Harribel's eyebrows moved upwards. You are aware that we are hollows and are capable of opening a Garganta, correct? Naruto stopped completely at that. He had indeed forgotten that they would be capable of doing that. They looked so human that he'd forgotten they were hollows for a moment. Turning to look about the warehouse, Naruto nodded. Alright, but wait a moment while I set up a temporary seal to block out sensors. That sort of thing would immediately send up some pretty big red flags back in Sirte, and they would be able to track it to the exit location in the world of the living. Harribel nodded and watched as he set about his work, dragging his finger through the dirt at their feet and drawing a strange series of kanji that didn't actually say anything coherent. He did so slowly and carefully, even though it would be relatively easy to use his reiatsu to create an imprint of the seal he had in mind. Then again, they were supposed to be incognito, and he couldn't have anybody detecting their reiatsu, no matter how brief or tiny the surge. Once done, Naruto nodded to Harribel as he very gently pushed the bare minimum of reiatsu into the seal to activate it, hoping that he could get away with even that much, even if it didn't matter much at this point. Even if any Shinigami had detected it, they would be long gone before they arrived. Harribel nodded, raising her right arm and snapping her fingers. In an instant, a dark gaping hole had opened in the air before them. The dark abyss staring back at him, not doing much to comfort him about his earlier suspicions. They could just trap him inside and forget he ever existed after all. Trapped between the dimensions for the rest of eternity. That was definitely not a comforting thought. Uber-long flashback of doom. End. It was a harrowing experience, having never traveled through a Garganta before, but he likened it to traveling through the Dangai. Really creepy either way you look at it. They had arrived in the human world without incident, his fears about their plans for him being unfounded, and set about getting themselves set up somewhere suitable. Karakura town had been the best option because of the atmosphere it possessed that was close in nature to either Hueco Mundo or Soul Society. Since it was all concentrated in one point, however, using the very reiatsu in the air to hide their presence was easier than it would be anywhere else. Harribel and her frakcion, having only ever briefly come to the human world before now, had acclimated to life there rather quickly. It had surprised him, since they were the ones who had explained to him just what several of these modern items were. Like the television remote control, cable, the internet, and Google. Among others, of course, there was so much Naruto had never seen before that it was startling. Sure, he had been on missions to the human world, but that was all over 100 years ago. They didn't even have a lot of things they had now back then. The iPod especially, that thing was just neat. All that music in such a tiny little thing. Apparently they picked up on these things rather quickly, or they already knew and had just told him differently to make him feel better. Or to give themselves an excuse to make fun of him. He could see them doing that, the frakcion anyway. Harribel wasn't the type. Sighing, Naruto tapped out the contents of his pipe and stood from where he'd been seated on the deck. Harribel and her frakcion had taken their gig eyes, heavily modified by several combinations of seals, and had gone out for the day to do whatever it is women do when men aren't around, so he was free to lounge about and relax. He'd been training non-stop for years now, and a few days of rest every now and then was appreciated. Then again, he started wondering about what the girls could be doing today. Every time they went out like this, they usually racked up his credit card bill and returned with bags upon bags of. He didn't even want to think about it. Clothes shopping, ugh, what a terrifying activity. Even now he wasn't sure he would survive 10 minutes of it. No matter how attractive the models, actually, that's probably what made the whole experience so dangerous for Naruto. The women he had living with him were attractive, just the thought of them in certain outfits was enough to give Naruto a rather impressive nosebleed. Now if only those 3 frakcion of Harribels could stop arguing for one day. No, for a few minutes. I swear, every few seconds those 3 come up with something to fight about, can they not just get along for a little while? It would save Harribel and I a few headaches at the very least, and would save me money on property damages as well. As he walked through his house, the memories of such times would haunt him. Shoji doors getting smashed to pieces, walls being broken down, and having his house nearly burned down for the second time in 200 years, nearly having given him a heart attack. Those girls, Mila Rose and Itachi especially, made living quietly impossible. Mila Rose and Itachi were the 2 usual culprits, while Sung-sun was more the quiet, but witty and sharp-tongued younger sister who enjoyed egging them on, while making it look like she was rebuking them. He liked Sung-sun, she was well-mannered and polite, intelligent and witty, but god if she didn't enjoy watching those 2 tear each other apart. The large amount of noise from the front door suddenly drew Naruto's attention as he made his way into the sitting room. He could hear Mila Rose and Itachi bickering about something again, but he could also hear another voice being added into the mix this time, and it wasn't Sung-sun or Mila Rose. Did they bring guests? That was odd, even though he'd never told them that they couldn't, they'd never brought a normal human to the house before. Though this sounded like an entire gang of humans instead of it being just one. Sitting down in his cushion pile, something he found he just couldn't part with, Naruto repacked his pipe and awaited the new arrivals with growing trepidation. He had a sudden feeling that he was going to regret not at least telling Harribel and the others what kind of company he'd meant when he'd laid those ground rules so long ago now. He just knew it. Harribel sighed as she watched her frakcion go at it again, and in the middle of the mall at that. They'd stopped for a bite to eat in the mall's large food court after a long day of shopping, food, clothes, accessories, and other womanly essentials being among the things they'd come looking for. Ending the day after having spent close to 1 million yen in the last 4 hours. The day had been going well until almost immediately after they'd started eating. Mila Rose and Itachi had apparently disagreed on which condiment was best for the dish they'd decided to eat, and it quickly devolved into what human males described as a cat fight. Alas, it was time for them to head on home and see to Naruto, as old men like him tended to get lonely quickly and needed the company that they offered, unless they wanted to see a grouchy sage when they got home. These being the words of Itachi one day when Naruto hadn't spoken to them for a full day after one of their 12-hour shopping stints. Of course, what only Harribel knew was that a group of Shinigami with strange reiatsu had appeared in Karakura that very day. He'd obviously been trying to figure out what such a large group of Shinigami had been doing in the human world and had been lost in thought. It happened to Naruto quite often, getting lost in his thoughts, she could swear that term could be used literally in his case. The reason they had all this money was because Naruto had started writing erotic literature only about 10 years ago. Apparently, they were quite the hit with a large portion of the male populace in the human world and a much smaller portion of females. She couldn't understand why, though she could honestly say she had nothing against the series either in spite of its crude nature and its tendency to demean and paint women as sexual deviants. She had even let Naruto use her as a model for one of the characters when he'd asked, but only after he'd clearly stated that he didn't need to see them in the nude, no matter how nice the experience might have been for him, and he wouldn't mention them by name. He was a gentleman with strong moral integrity, and even writing that book series seemed to put quite a bit of strain on him. When she'd asked why he wrote them if he didn't even like them, Naruto had replied that they were the work of his late godfather and that he'd promised to carry on his legacy a long time ago. That made it easier for her to understand his motives and easier still to not hold his particular choice of profession against him. It helped that it was such a great earner, making it possible for Harribel and her frakcion to live lives of leisure without having to worry about money. He treated the 4 of them very well, his seals took care of keeping the house dust-free, and he'd become a master of preparing cuisine. Considering he'd had at least 200 years to practice, it came as no surprise. He was practically a house husband, only he was the one who earned the money as well. Harribel wasn't sure if that's what being a house husband meant. Wasn't it the women who were supposed to be the big earners in that particular scenario? Shaking her head and deciding to break up the little argument in front of her before mall security was called again, Harribel stood from her seat and dumped the contents of her tray into a nearby trash can before making her way to the arguing girls, Sun watching from the side and giggling into her sleeve as always. The 4 of them had gone to great lengths to distance themselves from Aizen and their former lives as his servants, Sung-sun, having donned a more colorful pink shirt with over-long sleeves and a pair of dark dress pants and plain shoes. Itachi had taken to wearing a sleeveless black shirt with frayed shoulders, black jeans and runners. While Mila Rose had taken to wearing a leather jacket, wide undershirt and tight black leather pants and laced leather boots. Harribel herself hadn't changed much other than the color scheme of her outfit. The top was now black without the gloved extensions on the sleeves and a lower collar, so that her face was visible, since the gigai basically gave her the body of a human, and her bone fragments hadn't been part of the Pakage deal, so to speak, she didn't feel the need to hide her face anymore. Her hakama, however, had been replaced by a pair of black hip-hugging jeans, held up by a belt with a large silver buckle, terminating in a pair of high-heeled black boots. She had noticed the looks she received from people who saw her. Older women saw her as some sort of harlot if their disgusted expressions at her attire were anything to go by. While younger women looked at her with something akin to admiration or jealousy in the cases of those whose boyfriends and husbands all practically went brain dead at her mere sight. Even Naruto sometimes stopped to stare at her on the odd occasion, but he was much better at regaining control of himself quickly so that he didn't make a complete ass of himself. No wonder he found it so easy to use her as reference material for those books of his. She was practically half naked every day. Mila Rose, Apache, you're causing a scene. Instantly, it went quiet. Mila Rose and Apache having frozen in mid-punch or slap respectively, with a deer in headlights expression. The two untangled from each other quickly and uttered their apologies before following after Harribel as she left the food court, Apache vowing revenge on Mila Rose for making her look bad in front of Harribel-sama and Mila Rose brushing her off casually as she fired an insult into the shorter woman's face. This normally would have started another argument, but since their mistress was on the track to leaving them behind, they stowed their hostility for the moment and rushed after her, neither of them missing the fact that Sung-sun had been giggling into her sleeve for the past several minutes. After they'd gathered their bags, actually starting another fight over who would be carrying Harribel's bags, the group had headed off for the house of their new boss. They liked the newer boss more than the old boss, but they were still a little sore about that first meeting. Well, Apache and Mila Rose were, since they'd been beaten down so easily, while Sung-sun found humor in that particular memory as well. At least this boss wasn't a complete ouch like that last guy. He didn't sit in a throne waving his fingers at them imperiously or speaking down to them like one would a child. He was kind and gentle, polite and possessed a good sense of humor. He told them about his plans in their entirety and what he would need of them if they were to succeed. He was upfront and honest, very much unlike their last boss. Yet they could all tell he was sad. They could see it every day, his personal anguish creating a dull atmosphere on those days where it got really bad. They had at first thought it was about leaving the Soul Society, but had learned from Harribel that it was actually more than just that. Harribel was the only one he actually talked to as more than just an acquaintance, though it didn't help that the three of them walked on eggshells when around him either. They were about halfway home when they came across a large group of girls facing down an even larger group of boys. Both groups were made up of teenagers from the ages of 15 to 18, and all of them appeared to be armed. There were dozens of people walking hurriedly away from the scene, covering their faces with any object they might be holding as they made their escape, so as not to be identified. The territorial dispute. Weird, Harribel hadn't been aware of any gangs in the area. Then again, she never cared for such things either, so she probably just wasn't paying attention to it. All she cared about now was getting stronger and destroying Aizen. It appeared, however, that the boys were blocking their way, and this just would not do. Harribel continued forward, ignoring the warnings from the young women on the other side of the path as they took notice of her and her frakcion, but it wasn't needed. If the boys wouldn't move out of the way when she asked, then she would make them move. Stopping a few feet shy of one of the larger men in the group, Harribel looked him square in the eyes, or tried to anyways, since the moment he'd laid eyes on her his eyes immediately dropped down to her breasts. "Excuse me, my associates and I are trying to get home, could you please get off the street?" The large man simply continued to stare, but the rather roguish-looking young man with the dirty stubble and greasy long hair standing behind him answered for him. "Look at this, guys. This lady here wants us to leave the streets, should we get acquiesced to her kindly request?" There was a resounding denial, and a few compromises shouted into the air. Such things as having her and her frakcion go with them for entertainment or some other such nonsense. Of course, Harribel shook her head before lunging forward without warning. It was a massacre. One woman against a large group of well over 30 teenagers, and she was mopping the floor with them. Since they were still only children, she went easy on them, but even still it had ended just as quickly as it had started, lasting only a few minutes, but in the end, Harribel was left standing in a street littered with bruised and battered young men. All of which were either unconscious or lying on the ground and groaning as they clutched at their manhoods. Maybe that would teach them to respect their betters. Perhaps even to notice when they were simply outmatched. Before she could walk away, her and her frakcion were suddenly surrounded by the other gang, this one being apparently nothing but young women in their early to late teens. They all had stars in their eyes as they complimented her ceaselessly on her strength and her cool beauty. Saying they wanted to be just like her when they grew up. Of course, Harribel had no ideas on how she could deal with this new problem, so she simply pushed her way out of the group and continued on her way. Her number of followers now having increased from just 3 to nearly 60 in under a few minutes, much to her consternation. When the large group arrived at the mansion near downtown Karakura, the girls following them were once again in awe. A particular couple of girls, and one they'd snagged off the street on their way here that they'd called Tatsuki and Eki, walked up to Harribel and her frakcion, while dragging the red-faced young woman with the short and spiky black hair by her collar. The young woman had stopped trying to fight them off, considering she was pretty badly outnumbered, and had simply made it difficult on them. If they wanted to drag her along on their stupid little jettogether, they could literally drag her, and much to Harribel's hidden amusement, the girl had forced them to do just that. "Is this your house, Harribel One-sama?" As would be expected of such a strong and beautiful woman. One of her newest followers stated loudly, even the newest arrival seemed surprised and impressed. Harribel however took one look at the girl and shook her head. "I don't own this house, but I do live here with the one who does." Nodding, the girls all asked what they wanted to know next. Who could possibly own such a large house in Karakura, and what were they to their new One-sama? Harribel took a moment to think on that question before coming up with the best answer possible. "My boss." Naruto was not a betting man, but when he did gamble he usually won. Often showcasing his ability to send the world's wealthiest casinos into a downward spiral towards bankruptcy, in simpler terms, he cleaned them out. It was this particular talent that he was hating on right now. Since it would appear he did indeed need to clarify which company was acceptable company with Harribel and her frakcion. Why would he decide this was actually necessary? Simple. Sitting in his pile of cushions, eyebrow twitching in irritation in spite of the admittedly calm look on his face, Naruto sat smoking his pipe as he listened to Harribel explain what had happened to her and her frakcion this afternoon on their way back, while sitting in Caesar on the floor in front of him. Her frakcion sitting in a row behind her and what had to be 50 girls all sitting in neat rows of 10 behind them. 50 girls. In his house. Madness. It didn't help that these girls were all looking at him as if he were the enemy, but it was an all-girls street gang, some of them even looked like biker chicks. Of course they viewed him as the enemy, most of them were lesbians or feminists. Or both. He had a headache. This was ridiculous, he had never in his wildest dreams considered this as a possibility when they came here over 100 years ago. Yet Harribel was apparently the perfect definition of what these young women aimed to become in life. She was beautiful and unbelievable sexy, strong and taciturn. A woman of few words, but profound statements and strong beliefs, easily proving that women could be just as powerful as men. Even more so in some cases. She was, Naruto knew, the perfect role model for young women in their teens. Of course she would attract a following, he just didn't think it would happen so bloody quick and that she would bring them all to his house when she did. Then again, if they picked up her taste in clothing, the men of this world were doomed to raging erections and bloody noses every time they looked outside for the rest of eternity. He just refused to believe that most of these girls were still in high school, it just wasn't possible. Some of these girls had the figures of women in their 20s. At least with a role model like Tyr, the chances of them getting attacked by molesters or worse were lowered considerably. Well, the chances of them being capable of defending themselves should something like that happen rose considerably anyways. What man in his right mind would attack a woman who made it a point to aim for the testicles? Trust him, he would know. Many a spar had ended in extreme pain and ice packs on that particular extremity when she decided she wanted to actually win for once. It hurt. A lot. Exhaling a large cloud of smoke, Naruto sighed. Harribel. Well, I understand what happened, what I really want to know is why are they here? In my house. Sitting in Caesar in my sitting room and looking at me as if I'm some sort of mobster. Harribel blinked and actually had the decency to blush, though it was small and barely noticeable. They followed me home, and I decided that we could put them to good use here. Naruto raised an eyebrow in motion for her to continue as he idly puffed on his pipe. You have been working very hard lately, not only on our plans for the future, but in taking care of me and my frakcion as well. I believed we could have them take some of that burden off of your shoulders and use them around the house for what the people in this city call cheap labor. So, can we keep them? Saying it out loud, so bluntly and without a care for what the girls behind you would think about it. That's Tyr Harribel, ladies and gentlemen. Is that so? What can they offer me that I can't do myself just as easily? Harribel tilted her head to the side in thought, reminiscent of Naruto's own habit during his younger days, and something he still did every now and then. Time to yourself that you don't have to spend cleaning. Cheap labor. Security for the grounds. Did I mention cheap labor? Are these points good enough? Naruto hummed in thought, exhaling a plume of smoke through his nostrils as he did. He looked out over the girls in front of him, all of whom seemed to be looking at him intensely. They didn't seem to care that Harribel was basically signing them up for a job where they would basically be little more than maids, they were actually looking at him as if daring him to say no. With another sigh, Naruto leaned back in his pile of cushions and placed his pipe back in his mouth. Fine, anyone who agrees will be paid a flat rate of 2,500 yen per hour. If I tell you to do something, you do so immediately. My bedroom and the study are off limits, as are the shed in the yard. If you see kanji written on the walls, you are not to touch them, they are there for a reason. Noise is to be kept to a minimum, the only exception to this rule being training days. When Naruto fell silent, he bore witness to the dumbstruck expressions on the faces of those girls present. Their eyes were wide, and their jaws were hanging open, while Harribel and her frakcion had expected him to say yes in the first place. It was the kind of person he was. Naruto puffed on his pipe before closing his eyes. This starts now, Harribel is your taskmaster, so my first order to you all is to do as she says and leave me be. The girls all turned their attention to Harribel, who simply sighed. I guess we should figure out who does what before I send you home for the day. Let's go to the yard, ladies. So they did, and when the door closed behind them, Naruto was once again left in the quiet, empty sitting room. Sighing in content, Naruto did what he did best. Smoke his pipe and look awesome doing it. He loved his life sometimes, and absolutely hated it at others, it could get so surreal. Like what had just happened. He could swear he just accepted a demand from Harribel to let her keep some new pets. Arasawa Tatsuki sighed as she made her way home for the day, scratching her head in mild annoyance and slight confusion over the day's events. She had been walking home from school when she'd seen the large group of teenage girls walking in the opposite direction coming straight towards her. They were following a group of women that she'd never seen before and rambling on about something or other, ending all statements directed at the tall blonde with one Isama. So they'd found themselves a hot new boss with a whole cool and exotic beauty thing going for her, while boasting an admittedly frightening aura of strength. Good for them, but that was as far as her interest went. They'd been trying to recruit her for years, ever since she'd proven herself to be the second strongest girl of their age group in Japan. Her answer every time had been no, of course, she had no interest in such things, seeing them as a waste of her time and effort when she could be training or doing homework to keep her grades up. She hadn't expected them to literally grab her and start to drag her with them though. No request to join them, no explanation, they just grabbed her and continued on their way. She'd slugged a few of them without hesitation or regret, something that seemed to impress the tall blonde, if the raised eyebrow and small smirk were any indication, but in the end the girls ended up literally dragging her with them. After close to 15 minutes of walking, they'd come across the largest house Tatsuki had ever seen in her young life. She'd seen bigger in magazines and on TV, but never in real life had she actually been this close to such a place. She knew what this place was, of course. It was listed on the television program titled Japan's Rich and Famous as being owned by the author Uzumaki Naruto. One of the wealthiest men alive thanks in great part to his books and smart investing. She hadn't actually seen this place up close before, having heard only vaguely that it was located in the heart of Karakura and was owned by the mysterious author who was responsible for writing a certain book series that was beloved by men and some of the more extreme women the world over. He was almost never seen outside of his home, and when he was usually wearing traditional clothing and smoking a pipe. Tatsuki thought he was probably just some old pervert, was probably right too, since this house had only been owned by a single family under a single name for over 100 years. If the original owner was still alive, he was probably some wrinkly old gas bag with a butt fetish. When the beautiful blonde in the skimpy clothes had called him her boss, she amended that to wrinkly old mobster with a butt fetish. Upon going inside, however, her initial suspicions were proven to be grossly incorrect. For the first time in her life she had actually blushed at the sight of a man. Her eyes going wide and pupils dilating as her lips parted and jaw hung open. The man was nothing like what she'd expected. He was young and handsome, with long messy blonde hair tied into a single wild ponytail reaching down to his lower back, sharp oceanic blue eyes stared out from beneath messy bangs that framed his lean face, and his thin lips were set into a straight line around the mouthpiece of an ornate pipe. He was strong-jawed with high cheekbones and narrow eyes set beneath thin blonde eyebrows. His skin was a light tan, not like the type you see on all those actors or models, but a tan that was developed over years of working outdoors. He had broad shoulders leading down to highly defined pectoral muscles and shoulders, rock-hard biceps and magnificently developed triceps. The muscles in his abdomen were no different, some muscles that were visible on this man she'd never known could actually be developed to such a degree. His body was built for a combination of speed and strength, not sacrificing one for the other, but attempting to maintain a balance between them. He was wearing a red haori with a black flame pattern near the hem, reaching about a quarter of the way up the article of clothing, underneath which he wore a fishnet shirt that left his chest and abdomen bare, and a black hakama with white socks on his feet. She could see what the critics meant by traditional, but damn, this guy made it look good. Looking back over at the woman who had led them here, she compared the two and realized that the man in front of them was on a whole different level. If her aura was one of frightening strength, then this man was absolutely terrifying. She knew it then and there that this was a true master. Of what, she had no clue, but she knew it just the same. The man had sighed when he took notice of the large gaggle of young women in his home, before placing his pipe in his mouth and looking the blonde woman straight in the eyes. "Sit down and tell me what happened, Harribel." Her name was Harribel. What an odd name, she was obviously a foreigner, with her dark skin and bright blonde hair, but she couldn't think of any place where she could have come from. Hawaii maybe. The next hour found the entire group of girls, herself included, sitting in Caesar behind the Harribel woman and the other three she'd never seen with the gang before, as Harribel explained what she'd been up to that day. Apparently she and the other women had spent what amounted to, in Tatsuki's eyes, an obscene amount of money on clothes and other such pointless things, before Harribel had taken down an entire rival gang single-handed without a scratch. The man didn't seem surprised by any of this or angry about the amount of money they'd spent, so he was obviously paying them really well, or he was rich enough that he didn't care about how much of his money they spent. Probably both. After that, she'd explained what had happened afterwards and why these girls had followed her. Apparently they'd named her the new leader of their gang without her agreement, so she'd brought them here to actually put them to use. It was a large house, and Tatsuki hadn't seen any maids since she'd arrived, so it made sense. The way she said it though, damn if that wasn't funny. The looks on the girls' faces when they heard they were being reduced to menial chores around the home belonging to a member of the hated male species was absolutely priceless. Especially when said male was the author of a book series that demeaned women on almost every page. Over the last year or so, the book style had actually changed, however, they were no longer so demeaning towards women and had actually become rather tasteful. It was the reason why some women had actually become fans of the later books in the series, and if Tatsuki wasn't mistaken, Harribel had actually been used as a model for one of the characters that Honsho was so fond of. Honsho had always been a breast girl, and this woman had those in spades and clearly wasn't shy about showing them off either. Tatsuki had been even more surprised when the man had actually accepted, quickly laying down terms of employment and rules of his house before telling them to leave him in peace. 2,500 yen an hour. That was better than most of the jobs you could get with a college education. She was actually tempted to take his offer, but there was something she wanted to be absolutely sure of before she did. Whether or not the man was a pervert who simply hid it well, or if he was the genuine article. A rich man with far too much time on his hands that decided he'd write smutty books to pass the time and sate his urges. The imagination was a powerful thing after all, and it was proven that men thought about sex every 30 seconds, so why not put it down in a book and actually make use of those perverted thoughts? Had to be healthier than holding it in or expressing those thoughts by molesting the bouncy young women that surrounded them every day. Like Honsho. If this man was anything like that perverted lunatic, she'd beat his face in repeatedly. Just like she did Honsho every day. When she finally made it home, she had a quick dinner with her parents before heading to her room to get her homework done before school the next day. It was tough being a teenager in the world of today after all. The next day found Tatsuki doing much the same as she did every day. Meet up with Inoue Orihime on her way to school, beat up the admittedly smaller than usual group of creeps trying to get a date from said innocent girl, punch Honsho in the face when she attempted to grope said innocent girl's breasts, and study as hard as she could throughout the day until the lunch bell. When lunch finally came, she found herself outside with the usual group of girls, the school's resident lesbian Honsho Chizuru, Suzuki Mai, Kuniita Ryo, Ogata Michiru, and Mahana Natsui. They were very shortly joined by Orihime, who had gone to get her lunch, and the horrors that usually dwell within said bulging bentos, and the new girl Kichiki Rukia. Whose appearance at the school had Tatsuki a little weary. The girl was a good actor, but there was something about her that seemed fake. She could also have sworn that she and Ichigo knew each other. A secret affair perhaps? If that's the case, why make it secret? Ichigo was pretty high up on the list of eligible bachelors in the school, in spite of his hair color and thuggish reputation. Having a girlfriend would actually make things easier on him. Especially one who was as sweet as little Miss Kichiki. The height difference was a little disconcerting, but to each their own. They got into the usual conversation, with Honsho repeatedly making a grab for Orihime's breasts, and sometimes actually succeeding before Tatsuki decked her square in the face, and the other more carefree girls of their group discussing the latest guy on their list of interests. Debating about the best choices and why they would or wouldn't make a good boyfriend. For once, Tatsuki actually found herself contributing to that conversation, which surprised everyone present, even Orihime. Considering that when she spoke she actually blushed ever so slightly. I met someone just yesterday actually, that even Honsho would be interested in. For different reasons of course, but the sentiment is the same. Honsho raised an eyebrow at that one as the others urged Tatsuki to describe this guy in detail. When she did, she could literally see drool escaping from the corner of their mouths, their eyes glazed over as they fell into their fantasies in an attempt to create an image of this man. No wonder you're interested, you tomboy. The guy's a muscle-bound practitioner of some sort of martial art the very least. Honsho stated dryly. However, I don't see why I would be interested. You do know that I'm a lesbian, right? Seeing that she'd been unable to get Honsho with the program with her description of the man she'd met yesterday, she decided to drop the bomb on her. He's the owner of that big mansion downtown, you know, the one, surrounded by the really high wrought iron fence with a large yard and storage shed. Traditional Japanese architecture over 100 years old. Very well maintained. Seeing Honsho's eyes widen in realization, Tatsuki wasn't even able to get out his name before the lesbian beat her to it. Oh my god. Honsho cried loudly, lunging at Tatsuki and wrapping her arms around her waist, looking up into her face with sparkling eyes and a large perverted smile. You actually met him. My idol, the amazing and talented Uzumaki Naruto-sama. Unnoticed to everyone there, a certain Shinigami twitched at the name Honsho, had practically screamed to the heavens, her eyes widening in recognition for only a moment before returning to her magical juice box. Tatsuki drove her fist into the top of the perverted lesbian's skull, getting her to let go of her and back away to the other side of their little circle. Yes, Honsho, it was the same guy who writes those perverted erotic novels you like so much. I swear you're such a guy sometimes. I wish. Honsho cackled, getting over the pain in her cranium rather quickly as she fished through her bag and pulled out one of the books in question. It was small, barely larger than the student handbook, and colored a dark blue. This masterpiece was written by a true man, for all men to enjoy. He's my idol. Even though his books have gotten more tame over the years, they're still considered works of genuine art by fans and critics alike. He's the only man that I can say I am genuinely in love with. I feel such a connection to him even though I myself have never met him in person. I would go straight for him. Sweat drops forming on their heads, the girls all stared at Honsho, absolutely dumbstruck. You actually brought a piece of erotic literature with you to school. Can't you get expelled for that? Well, another question uttered by one of them went more along the lines of, Honsho actually likes a guy. The sky isn't falling, is it? Is that a pig flying? While Tatsuki herself had responded with a simple, please do, Chizuru. Maybe then she would leave poor Orihime in peace. Orihime meanwhile, continued eating her lunch, only vaguely listening in on their conversation and not really caring much about the subject. While Rukia kept an ear open towards the conversation yet tried to appear uninterested. If this was the same person her Nai-sama had told her about all those years ago, then he sure had changed. Her brother had described him as the perfect example of nobility, despite him being rather brash and impolite. And again, her brother had told her he died some 100 years ago now, so maybe it was his reincarnation. Shrugging her shoulders as she continued sipping away at her juice, Rukia decided it really wasn't worth fretting over. Even if this person's name was similar to the one the former head of the Namikaze clan had used when he'd been alive, it could actually just be one of the universe's strange coincidences. Besides, with the way her Nai-sama had described him, he was the last person she would expect to write erotica. Tatsuki was actually close to doubling over after listening to Honsho go on about her personal opinion on the man's character. She had actually met the man, and he didn't appear to be anything like Honsho imagined, in fact she would probably scar him for life. He appeared to be very old-fashioned, strong and unyielding, yet kind and well-mannered. She could be wrong, since she hadn't actually talked to him before, but that was what made interacting with new people interesting. You never knew what someone was like until you took the time to speak with them yourself and actually get to know them on your own terms. Honsho, however, while appearing very eager to meet the man, had him pegged as some sort of super pervert who groped women he found attractive at every opportunity and used the data gathered from the experience to write his books. In short, she pictured a male version of herself. Somewhere in Soul Society, a certain white-haired man wearing kabuki clothes paused in his random scribbling as he sneezed loudly. Looking up towards the sky with a grin, Jiraiya spoke proudly. Good job, Naruto, I just know you're out there somewhere spreading my awesome to the world. Looking back at his peephole, Jiraiya panicked, his sneeze and small monologue had drawn the attention of several of the women in the bathhouse. When he tried to run, he would quickly realize that all these women were members of the Shinigami Women's Society. As such, they were all Shinigami with varying degree of skill in shunpo. He didn't get far, and his freakish girly screams were heard all throughout Soul Society for hours on end. Back to the world of the living, their conversation had devolved into a series of questions and short answers as the girls tried to milk the tomboy for her opinion on this local hunk whose apparent female bodyguard was so strong she was supposedly able to take on an entire gang of delinquents by herself with ease. They could honestly say they'd never seen a man like what she was describing, but they had seen a woman that matched this Harribel's description, and Honshu had confirmed that she was indeed used as a model for one of the female police officers in Ichigo. Law and Order. She also commented on how steamy that particular book had been, since it had included several other tough, dominant and very curvy women, in addition to the attractive blonde woman, whom they had just confirmed was in fact a real woman. Honshu sat in a thinking pose, her legs crossed boyishly and her chin resting on the knuckles of her hand. Are all the women he uses in his books modeled after real women? If so, then this guy is my all-time favorite male ever, and a lucky bastard. I mean, how hard is it to share the wealth? Tatsuki sighed tiredly. I don't know if all the women in his books are real, since I didn't see any of the other women you described from that particular book in or around his house. In fact, I've never seen them around Karakura period. There's a good chance he used real-life people as a basis for his characters, but at this point the only confirmed real-life model used detail for detail was this Harribel woman who works for him. Tatsuki stood up to leave, since the bell was going to ring any moment now, but Honshu took a hold of her skirt and held on for dear life, nearly pulling the article of clothing off of her completely. Chizuru. Can you let me go? Lunch is practically over and I've told you everything I know. So let me go. But Tatsuki, you have to introduce me to him. You have to. We're friends, aren't we? Tatsuki ground her teeth in irritation. She really did not want Chizuru anywhere near this guy. There's no telling what would happen if she did as she was being asked, especially with those beautiful women living with him. Chizuru was sure to molest at least one of them when she saw them, since at least two of them were very well endowed, and all of them were adults. They were bound to call the police over such a stunt. Or kill her, they were super strong. That didn't sound too bad actually. No, Chizuru, there's no telling what you would do to those women living with him. I will not risk having that on my conscience. Now let go, you're ripping my skirt. Lifting her hand, she clenched it into a fist before bringing it down on top of the lesbian's head in a powerful blow that sent Chizuru crashing into the unforgiving ground face first. Her grip on Tatsuki's skirt loosening enough for the tomboy to pull away without any embarrassing incidents on her list of regrets for the day. Grumbling about stupid horny lesbians and their lack of restraint, Tatsuki huffed. Lunch is just about over, so I'm gonna head back. Come on, Orihime. Orihime had packed up her things as well, having finished her strange lunch. Honestly, who could stomach a meatball sub with chocolate sauce and bean paste? Which wasn't even the worst item on her menu that day. Hi, Tatsuki-chan. Jumping up, the bubbly girl hurried to catch up with Tatsuki, Chizuru and the others still sitting there under the tree. Tatsuki actually has a crush on somebody. Vegeta whispered quietly in disbelief. Ryo scoffed, her nose buried in one of her books as it had been for the entire conversation. She's a girl just like us, so it's not that surprising. Naruto frowned as he sensed a reiatsu of another hollow disappear. It wasn't so much the fact that he was worried about the hollows, it was the fact that the reiatsu of the Shinigami responsible had changed. It was stronger, more wild, and much warmer than the Shinigami he'd sensed several weeks ago. Knowing the Jusanbantai, the usual assignment for Shinigami was a tour of a month at the least. He'd sensed the Shinigami's reiatsu when they had first arrived, and then not several days later, he'd felt a massive blast of reiatsu overtake that of the Shinigami's, and only the larger source had remained. The transfer of power to a human. That hadn't happened in some time, in fact it was made a crime to do so after the last human had been given Shinigami powers and proven that his character left much to be desired. He'd witnessed the entire event and had to say he agreed with their decision. The young man had gone quite literally power mad. So if another human had been given the powers of a Shinigami after that last incident, especially such a powerful human, then he needed to be sure that they wouldn't become a threat. This was why Naruto had decided to leave his home after the sun had set and the moon had risen to take its place. Bathing the city in the soft glow of reflected light and providing him with a cover of shadow. Even just walking down the street as he was, an experienced Shinigami wouldn't be able to detect him unless he let them. Or he messed up and they actually saw him. When that large group had arrived in Karakura not 10 years after his own arrival, Naruto had been worried. He recognized their reiatsu of course, but it was the reason why they had come to the human world and never returned to Soul Society that had him worried. Had Aizen made his move and he'd missed it? No, if that had been the case then the rotations to the human world would have stopped and Karakura would be overrun by hollows. So why were they still here? He needed answers and there was only one way to get them. Of course, if he could just gather up the courage to face his old friends again after so long, then getting these answers would be easier than he was making it out to be. Knowing what he'd done to them was making it difficult. He deserved their anger, but that wasn't making it any easier. He was scared that they would hate him for what he'd done. It had felt like ages since he'd last had thoughts like that, but old habits apparently really do die hard. Humming up to his destination, Naruto read the sign above the door on the building called the Kurosaki Clinic. It was in the immediate area where he'd felt that strange surge of reiatsu, and stretching out his senses, momentarily confirmed his suspicions. Within the house he could sense the reiatsu of the human that had been the source of the ambient energy he was using to hide himself here in the human world, as well as the faint presence of that Shinigami he'd sensed before. The contrast between their reiatsu was obvious, one being warm and comforting, the other being chilling and cold to the feel, but it was now incredibly weak. Looking about the house, Naruto took in the sight of the cordoned-off area next to the house, where construction crews were working on fixing up the damage to the street. From what he could see, the damage to the home itself had been patched up for the most part, but the repairs to the street off to the side weren't even halfway finished yet. Stepping around the roadblock, Naruto made his way to the center of the area and gently reached out with his reiatsu. He needed to be sure of what happened here, and he needed to be sure that the Shinigami hadn't made a grave mistake in giving this human their power. The only way to do that would be to blanket the small area with his reiatsu, singling out the lingering reiatsu of those that had been present. Taking in what his reiatsu was telling him, Naruto willed his reiatsu to become visible to the naked eye. Covering the small area in a golden sheen, gaps in his reiatsu's flow could be made out rather easily, being the lingering reiatsu that he was looking for, blocking his light covering of reiatsu from filling the space they occupied. He could make out 4 shapes, 2 of which appeared to be small children, while the other 2 were larger. The Shinigami and the human they'd given their power. What really concerned him, however, was what he was seeing before his eyes. His reiatsu had converged around the location of the massive surge of reiatsu he'd sensed from the night before, stretching high up into the sky in a shape that resembled a blooming rose. Soft spires stretching high into the sky from a massive dome where the human's reiatsu still lingered strongly. Frowning once again and puffing tentatively on his pipe, Naruto let his reiatsu fade. The thought of a human possessing that kind of power was disturbing. In his world such a thing was normal. Par for the course, as it were, but this was not his world. A human with that kind of power could very easily be corrupted by that power. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It was a law of the universe, and only those with significant moral fortitude could resist human nature itself. Breathing out a cloud of smoke, Naruto made to turn away from the area when a voice stopped him cold. "So you're alive, Naruto?" Standing outside of the large manor house known to be owned by Japan's most famous author, Kurosaki Isshin, formerly Shiba Isshin and father of Kurosaki Ichigo, shook his head in disbelief. The house was surrounded by young women of varying ages and body types, all wearing black leather jackets and blue jeans. It almost looked like some kind of uniform, and considering that they were patrolling the grounds in and outside the tall fence, he was inclined to believe that was indeed the case. "What in the hell have you been doing, Naruto?" Isshin wondered. He had been trying to get inside for some time. Of course he could just go in soul form, but he hadn't yet recovered enough of his strength to do so safely. So he was stuck using the usual route. The girl standing guard at the gate wouldn't let him in, even though he'd said he had an appointment with Naruto, their boss, apparently simply because he was male. Coincidentally, Naruto was the only man they actually liked because of the high pay rate and benefits he was giving them for guarding his estate. He really didn't like visitors apparently, which meant he was still the same old Naruto. Their conversation last night had been short in usual Naruto fashion. He was a man of few words, a far cry from how he'd been in life according to Yoruichi. Then again, he'd lost his children when he died, and Isshin could understand how that could change a man. When he'd lost Misaki he could hardly bear it, but if he were to lose one of his children, it would tear him apart. Naruto had ultimately lost the chance to be with both of his children, whom he'd loved dearly in spite of the fact that they'd yet to be born, and because of how soul society works, he might never see them again. Never. He told Isshin last night that he hadn't had much of a choice, that leading the whole of Soul Society to believe he died was the only way for him to gain any kind of significant advantage over his enemy. It was an enemy that Isshin knew all too well thanks to Yoruichi and Urahara. To think that Aizen had been ultimately responsible for Naruto's supposed death and self-imposed exile as well, just how far was Aizen's reach? They had ended their conversation with Naruto giving Isshin directions to his home and telling him to meet him there so they could talk in private before he'd left the scene like a ghost. Simply stepping back into the shadows and vanishing completely. Isshin still wasn't used to that. When Isshin was turned away for what must have been the 100th time in the last hour, he was about to give up and try another day when a voice directly behind him made him turn. "What's going on here?" When he turned he was treated to the sight of 4 very attractive young women. The leader was only a few inches shorter than he was, with short messy blonde hair, with 3 braided locks falling away from her head, blonde eyebrows and thick blonde eyelashes, and vivid aquamarine eyes. She was wearing a very revealing black top with long sleeves that left her abdomen and the lower half of her large breasts exposed. A pair of dark blue jeans adorned her legs and high-heeled boots topped off the outfit, making for quite the beautiful yet imposing sight. Behind her were 3 other women, a heterochromatic young woman, one eye being blue and the other amber, with short black hair cut in a bob style. The other was a dark-skinned woman as tall as the blonde, with thick wavy brown hair reaching down past her shoulders, while the last was the shortest of the group, with a dainty face adorned with 3 pink dots beneath her right eye and long olive green hair. They were quite the lookers, but the fact he couldn't sense anything from them, not even so much Ryukyu as that of a normal soul, told him that Naruto had placed seals on them to hide their presence. Meaning in short that they were not normal human souls. Isshin, however, decided to lay on the charm. While he would only ever truly love his dearly departed Misaki, these were some very fine women in front of him. He wouldn't be able to call himself a true man if he didn't at least show some interest after all. He needed some loving every now and then too, you know. Why hello there ladies, I was just telling these fine young gate guards here that I had an appointment with their employer. Maybe you could let me in and give me the grand tour. Isshin stated proudly, his twinkling pearly whites displayed in a broad smile, standing in the signature good guy pose. Of course, the 4 women merely deadpanned in his direction, completely dumbfounded at his blatant attempt at a pickup. That had to have been the poorest attempt at seducing them that they'd seen in a long time. Harribel sighed. How about not? Isshin instantly deflated and Harribel pushed past him, her frakcion following along behind. Naruto-sama told me you would be coming, shibbed Isshin. Come, it would not do to keep him waiting, he's stressed enough as it is. Not enough loving from his lady friends most like. Keeping all that sexual frustration pent up inside isn't healthy after all. Harribel stopped, taking in his words for a moment and actually seeing how that could be possible. Well, he did write those books of his, he was also living with 4 very attractive women and not once had he ever expressed such a need before. She had read books on human psychology and had learned that sexually frustrated males tended to experience sickness more often than those who engaged in regular sexual activity. So what Isshin said, while initially sounding perverse and idiotic, actually had merit. Stowing that bit of information away for the time being, Harribel led Isshin inside much to the said gate guard's consternation and brought him to the sitting room where Naruto could be seen in his usual position on the deck, pipe in hand, and a tray with a few sake dishes and a single large jug sat beside him. When Isshin saw him, he immediately made his way over to take a seat beside him. Taking one of the dishes set out on the tray and filling it with sake before he simply sat there in silence with his nephew. The silence stretched on for a few minutes, both just looking out into the large yard where several young women were sparring against each other, using various styles of martial arts. Yoruichi cried, you know. Naruto said nothing, but the pain that flashed across his face told Isshin all he needed to know. When they'd arrived at his homestead all those years ago, only to find the scorched and bloody remains of his Haori, it had been painful. Even Isshin had needed to take a break from active duties for a while to recover. To know that Naruto hadn't done it to hurt them made it easier for Isshin not to be upset with him. Yoruichi was going to be pissed though. Never mind how Kukaku was going to react. I'm sorry Isshin, but as I've already explained, there was little other choice. Naruto spoke calmly, taking a sip of his sake before continuing quietly. I knew it would hurt all of you, but Aizen had discovered my investigation and I had lost the element of surprise. To get it back, I needed to make Aizen think his attempt at assassinating me was successful. Isshin nodded, it made sense, Aizen liked to be in control, and by effectively killing himself in the eyes of Soul Society, he had hidden himself from Aizen until he was ready to move against him. The shock of realizing he hadn't been able to predict Naruto's continued survival and intervention in his plans might just be enough to force Aizen into making a fatal mistake. Kukaku knew you were alive, Naruto. Or at the very least she denied your death so strongly that she even had me believing it, she wouldn't hear any talk of you being dead. She would say things about how you were too stubborn to let some hollow kill you like that, how there was no way you would die before keeping your promise to her. Isshin muttered quietly. Naruto sighed, but the small smile on his lips told of the amusement he felt at that particular train of thought. She knows me too well, Isshin. I'm not surprised that she would realize I wasn't really dead, and I do still have to keep that promise to her, don't I? Isshin chuckled. Which one was it? The one where you would find a way to give her back that arm of hers? Or the one where you wouldn't stop making babies until you had enough to create your own division in the Gatija Sentai? Naruto blinked. That second one doesn't sound like me at all, Isshin. You sure you didn't just make that one up? Laughing, Isshin slapped Naruto on the back enthusiastically. Of course not, nephew. I have a very accurate memory when it comes to these things. A selective memory more like. Your ability to imagine these scenarios never ceases to amaze me. You're just lucky Kukaku isn't here, Isshin, she'd kill you. Naruto deadpanned flatly. Isshin chuckled. All joking aside, I should tell you that Kukaku took on your name. She's taken over as the head of the Namikaze clan in the Sirte, and she says all that needs to happen now is for you to crawl out of whichever hole you've managed to find yourself in and get back where you belong. Isshin sipped his sake, emptying the dish before placing it on the deck in front of him. You never actually told me what happened, Naruto. What was it that attacked you? The kind of damage we saw at the scene was comparable to at least a Minos, yet no Minos was seen in the area. Naruto sighed, actually regretting this part of the conversation. The revelation of just what Tira and her frakcion were would throw Isshin for a loop. Urahara would definitely want to get his hands on them, for research and just for the sake of it. That guy was a pervert almost on the level of his late godfather. You ever heard of an arrancar, Isshin? Isshin frowned, but nodded. Hollows that have somehow managed to take off their masks and survive the process. Infinitely more powerful than a Vasto Lord Minos Grand. Are you saying you were attacked by one of those things? Naruto nodded, taking a few puff on his pipe. Not just any arrancar either, one of the arrancar created by Aizen's Hogyoku. Much more powerful than a natural-born arrancar, and much more human. They practically look human, Isshin, the only difference being the hollow hole and bone fragments from what used to be their mask adorning their bodies. That, and they have Zanpakuto. Isshin choked. Zanpakuto? He gave hollows the power of a Shinigami? I had thought it was possible, seeing as to what he did before, but I didn't think he'd actually tried it yet, let alone succeeded. Naruto nodded, filing that little piece of information away for later, before looking over his shoulder into the house. Tyr, come over here please, and get out of your gigai. There was no verbal answer, but several moments later Tyr walked into the sitting room behind them, her once wide arrancar robes replaced by a similar black set. Her Zanpakuto in its as usual place on her upper back and the bone-like protrusions running up her spine. Isshin looked back at her and his eyes widened. She's. Yes, Isshin, this is Tyr Harribel, former Tres Espada and a Vasto Lord class arrancar. She and her frakcion, or servants as it were the ones who attacked me back then on Aizen's orders. Putting out his pipe, Naruto nodded to Harribel, letting her know it was alright to leave. She however mistook that for something else, and as she unzipped her jacket, Isshin was sent rocketing off the deck and into the yard by a massive explosion of blood from his nose. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Naruto growled. I am not cleaning that up. After Isshin recovered from his little episode, the three of them adjourned to the sitting room and closed the shoji doors leading out onto the deck. Once they were assured of their privacy, Naruto began to explain to him what he'd found out that had forced Aizen's hand. I believe my discovering the fact that Aizen had his own incomplete Hogyoku was what had forced Aizen to act against me. It would obviously have given me the leverage I needed to bring his scheming to light before the Taichu. I had been making plans to retrieve his Hogyoku for solid proof, and since the Hogyoku that Urahara had created was kept under lock and key, the Taichu would have been forced to believe my arguments and make a move. Naruto leaned back into his cushions, pointing his pipe at Isshin for emphasis. He must have discovered my plans somehow, and it had frightened him into acting prematurely. He sent Harribel here to ensure that I was destroyed, but since he had no knowledge of my power, he had no way of knowing that what he considered overkill wouldn't be nearly enough to keep me down. Aizen had told me that he knew next to nothing about Naruto-sama, not even how strong he was. He was confident however that I would have little issue taking care of him. Harribel stated calmly. Even though Aizen had unknowingly ordered me to my own death, he'd also presented us both with an unusual opportunity. Aizen would have believed that Naruto had died of his wounds shortly after defeating me and my frakcion. Giving both of us the cover we needed to, as Naruto-sama put it, stay under the radar. Naruto nodded. While Aizen would believe both of us dead, we could hide ourselves away and grow stronger so that we would be ready to act when the time came. The circumstances behind our current allegiance being inconsequential however, just know that she's on our side. Naruto puffed on his pipe for a moment, a thoughtful look on his face. Do we know what Aizen's after? Isshin nodded. Urahara's completed Hogyoku. It's currently hidden away in the soul of one Kichiki Rukia, the Shinigami who was assigned to Karakura not too long ago. She was forced to give her powers to my son Ichigo when our home was attacked by an Ajucha's class Minos. It is precisely that however that gave Urahara the opportunity he needed. Naruto shook his head sadly. Let me guess, he gave her a modified gigai that will slowly change her soul into that of a normal human. She'll lose her powers as a Shinigami, but the Hogyoku will never be recovered once she dies and enters the cycle of reincarnation. Isshin grunted. I don't like how he's going about it, but it is imperative that Aizen doesn't get his hands on the Hogyoku. There's no telling what he'll be able to do with a completed Hogyoku, if this he gestured towards Harribel at this point, is what he can do with an incomplete one. Naruto hummed his agreement as he held his pipe to his lips. It would have been best for one of us to volunteer, at least that way we wouldn't have to deceive anyone. Urahara means well, but he's practically forced the young Kuchika's involvement in this whole thing without her knowledge or consent. Suddenly, Naruto was struck by a rather strange thought. You have kids, Isshin. When did you get hitched? Isshin blinked and looked over at Naruto owlishly. I didn't tell you about your auntie Misaki, did I? Suddenly, Isshin was all smiles, practically bouncing about on the floor as he pulled a photo album out from nowhere. Sidling up next to Naruto, he started showing him various pictures of a small boy with bright orange hair and two twin girls who quite obviously came along later, if the fact they only started appearing the further they went into the album was any indication. Naruto watched Isshin practically bursting with fatherly pride as he described each of his children. This went on for some time, the sun outside already beginning to set, before he frowned. "That son of mine though, he's become such a delinquent. Oh Masaki." Jumping up, Isshin pulled a life-size photo of a beautiful red head from his jacket. How it fit in there without using a storage seal Naruto would never know, before he pinned it to a wall and threw himself against it, acting as if he were trying to wrap his arms around the woman on the poster. "Where did I go wrong?" he bawled. Naruto and Harribel turned to look at each other, both their expression being of utter confusion. When Harribel's eyebrow raised in question, all Naruto could do was shrug helplessly in response, before they both turned their attention back to the weeping man. Next thing he knew, Isshin was right in front of him on his knees, his head bowed. "I beg of you Naruto, bestow some of your wisdom and knowledge upon your delinquent cousin. Show him how a true member of the Shiba clan should be. Show him what it means to be a true man." Naruto looked at Isshin then, as if he had gone completely bonkers. His pipe was hanging loosely from his mouth as his jaw slackened. "If he's got you this concerned he must be doing just fine, besides, I'm a namikaze, not a Shiba. You'd be better off asking Kukaku about that kind of thing, and I'm sure Kane wouldn't be adverse to showing your son how a true man of the Shiba clan is supposed to act. He does it a damn sight better than you do Isshin." Naruto sighed as Isshin crouched down in the farthest corner of the room, drawing circles on the floor with his finger as a rain cloud hovered over his head. He was mumbling about inconsiderate nephews and how he was so unloved by his family. Truth be told, it was kind of creepy. "Enough Isshin, you're embarrassing yourself," Naruto growled, and taking another puff of his pipe he stood up and made his way to the door. "Are we done here for the day then Isshin?" Isshin sighed, but nodded. "Yoruichi's gonna kill you when she finds out you've been here all these years." Naruto raised an eyebrow. "I had assumed she would have found me by now. She's been in Karakura town for 100 years or so now." Isshin grunted his acknowledgement of the fair point. "She's been running back and forth between Soul Society to gather information on the goings-on in the Sirte. I'm afraid she hasn't had much time to come out and actually explore much of the city. That, and you're very well hidden, I almost missed this place even when I was invited here." "A new seal?" Naruto nodded. "That it is, it's engraved in the walls and on the fence outside. Its purpose is misdirection. The higher the level of an individual's reiatsu then the more effective it is in doing its job. Which is to force your attention away from the building. It alters your perception of the area and forces one to think that the house isn't anything of any real importance. By the time you realize you're being duped, you'll already be so far away that you won't know what it was that was influencing you in the first place. Of course, one's knowledge of the house actually affects the effectiveness of the seal, and if someone who's been here before were to bring you here, then the seal wouldn't work at all." Isshin nodded. "Interesting seal then. No wonder she hasn't found you if that's the case. A house covered in seals would usually be a dead giveaway." Naruto scoffed. "That's exactly why I made that seal. Can't give myself away just doing what's normal for me." When Isshin reached the front door, he slipped on his shoes and opened the door before he paused and turned to Naruto. "Naruto, can I ask you a favor, one father to another?" Naruto frowned. It was odd seeing Isshin actually get serious, but a serious request from Isshin was usually worth at least hearing. When Naruto nodded his affirmation, Isshin gave him a pat on one of his broad shoulders, marveling at the fact that even doing that much had hurt his hand before speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone. "Keep an eye on Ichigo for me. If I actually had the power to do so I would, but thanks to certain events that's not an option. Make sure he doesn't get hurt too badly will you?" Naruto sighed, knowing right away that his life was about to get hectic again. "Alright Isshin, but you have to promise me something as well. I'm going to be training him, no ifs and or buts about it. Deal?" Isshin swallowed nervously, suddenly more worried for his son than he had been before. Training with Naruto he was feeling sorry for Ichigo already. "Alright Naruto, I give you my permission to train my son. Just don't kill him." "Good." Naruto then shoved Isshin out the door before stepping out behind him. "Now get out of my house, you've been here long enough. Your kids are probably getting worried." Isshin nodded before waving as he started on his way down the street. "Until next time then, nephew." "Later you weirdo." Naruto grumbled as he closed his front door. Heading back to his sitting room, Naruto sat himself back down in his cushions and set his pipe down on its stand. Thinking about what Isshin had asked him to do. Ichigo technically being his cousin actually made it his responsibility to make sure the kid didn't get himself killed, but he knew the day was getting close. Aizen was going to make his move soon, he just knew it. He would need to train Ichigo and make sure the kid was ready for that day even if it killed him. Then he had to go and see Urahara. They had much to talk about apparently, after all, he'd forgotten to ask Isshin about why Urahara and Yoruichi had left Soul Society. This better not come back to bite me in the ass. Then again, life for Naruto was never easy. So this part ends here. Alright, that's it for today's video guys, let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video, bye bye.